She didn't text me. She didn't email me. She left a voicemail. 37 seconds. That's all it took for my mother to dismantle 28 years of what I thought was unconditional love. 37 seconds of her voice. Calm, cold, almost rehearsed. Saying the 7 words that changed everything. Don't come back. You are no longer welcome here. And then, a click. No explanation. No argument that led to it. No dramatic fight the night before. Just 37 seconds, a Tuesday afternoon, and a mother who decided her child was disposable. But here's what she forgot, and what they all forgot. I wasn't just her daughter anymore. I was the trustee. And trustees? We have power. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, you're in the right place. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to True Revenge Tales, because justice always has a story worth telling. My name is Serena, and for as long as I can remember, I have known exactly what it feels like to be in a room full of people who are supposed to love you and still feel completely, devastatingly alone. It is not the kind of loneliness that announces itself loudly. It does not come with tears at the dinner table, or dramatic arguments that clear the air. It is quieter than that, more insidious. The kind that seeps into the walls of your childhood, home, and settles into the foundation so deeply that you start to mistake it for normalcy. You start to think that being invisible is simply who you are, rather than something that was done to you, slowly and consistently, by the people who were supposed to see you most clearly. That was my life growing up, and for the longest time, I accepted it the way you accept weather. Not because it was fair, but because it was simply what surrounded me every single day, and I did not yet understand that I had the right to want something different. My brother Marcus was everything our mother Patricia ever wanted in a child, and she made absolutely no effort to conceal that fact. He was loud where I was quiet, charming where I was careful, magnetic in that effortless way that some people are simply born into, as though the universe decided before they took their first breath that doors would open for them and people would lean in when they spoke. Marcus walked into rooms and conversations reorganized themselves around him. He was the captain of his football team, the one teachers remembered 10 years after graduation, the son my mother introduced to strangers, with a particular brightness in her eyes that I studied for years, hoping to one day understand what I would have to do or become to earn even a fraction of it. He never had to try to be her favorite. It was simply a fact of our household, as established and unquestioned as the furniture arrangement or the smell of her cooking on Sunday mornings. And we all, Marcus, my father, and I, moved around it without ever naming it out loud. I became, as many overlooked children do, extraordinarily observant. When you are not the one being watched, you become the one who watches, and I watched everything. I watched how my mother's posture changed when Marcus called versus when I called. I watched how dinner conversations that began neutrally would eventually find their way back to something Marcus had done or said or achieved, like water finding the lowest point in a room. I watched how my father, quiet, steady, deeply loving in his understated way, would sometimes glance at me across the table with an expression I could not fully decode when I was young, but came to understand much later as a kind of gentle apology, the look of a man who saw what was happening and carried the weight of not knowing how to fix it without tearing everything apart. I loved my father for that look. I loved him for seeing me even when he could not always say so. And I held on to those glances, like small treasures through all the years of being background noise in my own family. While Marcus coasted, I built. I studied accounting not because anyone encouraged me toward it, but because numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes did not. Numbers did not have favorites, did not shift their treatment of you based on how charming you were or how loudly you laughed. I read legal documents for recreation. I understood trusts and estate planning and asset management before most of my peers, understood how to file a basic tax return. And none of this made me interesting at parties, but it made me capable in ways that would one day matter enormously. I was meticulous, methodical, and deeply competent. And almost none of that was ever acknowledged by my mother, who had a very specific definition of success that looked a lot like Marcus and very little like me. I built my career quietly, paid my bills on time, made responsible decisions that nobody applauded, and kept showing up to family holidays with a smile that cost me more energy than anyone knew. Then my father got sick, and the architecture of our family, already tilted, already slightly broken in ways we had all agreed not to discuss, began to show its cracks in ways that could no longer be ignored. Dad had spent his lifetime building something modest but meaningful, the kind of wealth that does not make headlines but represents Decades of discipline and sacrifice and choosing the future over the present moment again and again. There was the family home, a property worth $340,000, in a neighborhood that developers were beginning to eye with increasing interest. A trust fund of $180,000 designated for Marcus and me, and various other assets that required careful, knowledgeable hands to manage properly during what everyone understood would be a painful and complicated transition. Dad knew exactly whose hands he trusted. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house quiet in that particular way. It gets when something important is about to be said, and he sat me down while Marcus was out somewhere, doing what Marcus always did, existing loudly in a world that rewarded him for it. Dad looked at me with those steady eyes of his and he said, without preamble, without sentimentality, with the directness of a man who understood he was running out of time for anything other than the truth, that he needed me to be the trustee when he was gone. He said I was the only one who would not let emotion burn it all down. He said he had watched me my whole life. And those words cracked something open in my chest, because being seen by him, truly seen and named and chosen, was something I had needed for so long that receiving it in the shadow of his illness made it both the most beautiful and most heartbreaking moment of my adult life. I cried. He asked me to promise. I promised, and I meant it with everything I had. When Dad passed 8 months later, the grief was enormous and shapeless, the kind that does not behave the way people expect grief to behave. I could not afford to simply collapse into it, because he had handed me a responsibility, and honoring that responsibility was the only way I knew how to honor him. I hired an estate attorney immediately. I organized every document, cataloged every asset, communicated with financial institutions and legal representatives with the professionalism of someone twice my age. I was meticulous in my grief, channeling it into action the way my father had always channeled his emotions, quietly, purposefully, with an eye always on what needed to be done rather than what he was feeling in the moment. It was the most exhausting period of my life, and I did it almost entirely alone. And Marcus moved back into my mother's house within weeks of the funeral, citing stress, citing the weight of grief, citing a dozen softly spoken reasons that my mother accepted, without question, because Marcus and she had never once required him to be accountable for the space he took up in the world. He stopped paying rent somewhere else, and let himself be absorbed back into the comfort of home. And my mother, lonely now, unmoored by the loss of her husband, perhaps more dependent on her golden son than she had ever allowed herself to admit, welcomed him completely. I did not begrudge him the grief. What I noticed, quietly and with growing unease, were the closed-door conversations that went silent the moment I appeared. The phone calls that Marcus took in other rooms. The way my mother's eyes would flicker toward him when I brought up estate matters, as if checking for his reaction before forming her own. The subtle but unmistakable sense that something was being arranged behind a door I was not allowed to open. I noticed all of it. And in the way I had been trained by a lifetime of being underestimated, I said nothing. I kept showing up, kept doing my job as trustee with absolute integrity, kept believing, because I needed to believe, that family was still family, even imperfect and lopsided family, even family that had never quite figured out how to love me the way I deserved to be loved. I kept showing up because that is what I had always done, and because my father had asked me to protect his legacy, and I was not going to let loneliness or hurt feelings or the quiet wrongness of those closed-door conversations stop me from being exactly who he believed I was. Then came the house deal. A developer approached with a serious offer. $412,000 for the family property. I negotiated carefully, professionally, pushed the number higher, and began preparing for closing. I called my mother and Marcus to align on timing. Mom seemed distracted. Marcus nodded like a man listening to weather he had no interest in. I booked a hotel, drove 4 hours with flowers on the passenger seat, knocked on a door that did not open, and sat in my car for 40 minutes, watching the flowers slowly wilt. And somewhere, in that parking lot silence, a voicemail landed in my phone that would make 37 seconds feel like a lifetime. I am an accountant by profession and by nature. And what that means. What people who have never lived inside a numbers-driven mind sometimes fail to understand is that when the emotional ground beneath my feet gives way completely, when the people I love do something so stunning and so cruel that my heart genuinely does not know what to do with it, my brain does not shut down. It sharpens. It narrows like a lens finding its focus. And it begins almost automatically to look for data, for patterns, for the concrete and verifiable truth that exists underneath. Whatever story is being performed on the surface, it is not that I do not feel things. I felt everything sitting in that diner booth with cold coffee, and 37 seconds of my mother's rehearsed voice, still echoing through my earbuds. I felt the particular devastation of being rejected, not in a moment of passion or explosive anger, but calmly, deliberately, as though the decision had been made long before the recording started, and I was simply the last to be informed. I felt it land in my chest like something heavy and permanent, but I did not stay there, because staying there would not have helped me. And more importantly, staying there was exactly what they were counting on. They expected tears. They expected pleading phone calls and desperate texts, and the kind of emotional spiral that would keep me distracted and reactive while they moved pieces around a board I was not supposed to realize was already in play. So instead of giving them what they expected, I drove back to my hotel room, opened my laptop, poured a glass of water I did not drink, and I started pulling documents. What I found in those documents over the next 2 hours was not shocking in the way a sudden explosion is shocking. It was shocking in the way that a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly image by image, each detail clarifying the one before it until the full picture is undeniable and you realize with a cold, sinking certainty that you have been looking at the outline of this picture for months, without allowing yourself to see it completely. Marcus had found a buyer, not the legitimate developer I had been carefully negotiating with for weeks, not someone who had gone through proper channels or engaged with the estate through legal representation, but a private buyer, a friend of a friend, the kind of arrangement that exists specifically in the shadows of deals that cannot survive daylight. This buyer had offered $368,000 for the family property, which was $44,000, less than the number I had already negotiated on behalf of the estate, and on the surface that alone would have been infuriating enough. The idea that my brother had gone behind my back to arrange a sale at a significantly lower price, costing the trust tens of thousands of dollars that belonged to both of us, to our mother, to my father's legacy. But the surface was not the whole story. Hidden inside this arrangement was the detail that revealed everything about Marcus's actual motivation. His private buyer had agreed to pay $15,000 of the purchase price in cash, off the books, directly to Marcus personally, not to the trust, not to the estate, not to be split or documented or distributed, according to the legal instruments my father had put in place, directly to Marcus, invisibly, in a transaction designed to leave no trace that the law could easily follow. He had not just tried to cut me out of the decision. He had tried to steal from the estate, from our father's carefully built legacy, from me, and he had done it while standing in our mother's house, eating food from her kitchen, wrapping himself in the grief of a son who had barely shown up during our father's illness, performing mourning for an audience of one, our mother, who had always been his most devoted viewer. The rage I felt reading those documents was clean and cold and clarifying in a way that messy emotional rage never is. It did not make me want to scream or cry, or call him and demand an explanation he would only talk his way around. It made me want to be precise. It made me want to be surgical. It made me want to use every single tool that my father had, legally and deliberately placed in my hands, and I wanted to use them with the kind of quiet, devastating accuracy that Marcus, who had spent his whole life winning through charm rather than competence, would never see coming. But the financial scheme was only the first layer of what I uncovered. The deeper and in some ways more painful discovery was understanding the timeline of what Marcus had been building long before the voicemail, long before the developer offer, possibly long before our father had even passed away. Those closed-door conversations I had noticed for months. The phone calls taken in other rooms, the way my mother's eyes checked Marcus before forming opinions. None of that had been paranoia on my part. It had been reconnaissance without knowing it. Marcus had been systematically working on our mother for an extended period, feeding her a narrative in which I was not the competent, devoted daughter who had taken on the trustee role out of love and commitment, but rather a cold, controlling, untrustworthy figure who was managing the estate for my own benefit at the family's expense. He had reframed my professionalism as arrogance. He had reframed my careful documentation as secrecy. He had taken every quality my father had recognized and trusted in me and fed it back to my mother through a filter that made each one look sinister. And my mother, grieving, isolated, emotionally dependent on the one child, who had always made her feel most needed, had absorbed his version of events with the uncritical acceptance of someone who wanted very badly to believe that the person sitting next to her at the dinner table was still worthy of her complete trust. He had also apparently presented himself to her as the more natural choice for overseeing the estate, the man of the family. He had reportedly said, a phrase so calculated in its appeal to my mother's generational instincts that I almost had to admire the cynicism of it. He had convinced her that the estate needed his leadership, that I had been cutting corners or making unilateral decisions, that the family would be better served by placing trust in him, rather than in the legal instruments my father had put in place for very specific and very good reasons. And my mother, who had always found it easier to believe Marcus, who had spent decades practicing the comfortable habit of organizing the world around his preferences and capabilities, had agreed. She had agreed so completely that she had stood in a room and recorded a voicemail on his instruction, reading words he had likely helped compose, locking me out of my own childhood home while her son stood nearby, making sure she did not deviate from the script. Understanding all of this did not make me want to forgive it. What it did was remove every remaining trace of hesitation from my next steps. I called my estate attorney that night, and I told her everything, not emotionally, not with the trembling voice of a wounded daughter, but with the precise chronological clarity of a trustee reporting a potential breach. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said in the most beautifully measured professional tone I have ever had the pleasure of receiving, that they had no legal authority to do anything without me, that the trust was entirely under my management, and that she needed to know what I wanted to do. And I told her I wanted to freeze everything, all trust assets, all pending transfers, all access, effective immediately. I told her I wanted the legitimate house deal halted pending legal review. And I told her I wanted a full informal audit of any attempts to access or move trust assets without my documented authorization, because I already suspected that what I had found in those documents was not the entirety of what Marcus had attempted. The freeze went into place within 48 hours, and the effect was immediate and absolute. The legitimate developer was notified of the legal hold and had no choice but to stand down. Marcus's private buyer, who had never had a legally binding contract, because Marcus had never possessed the authority to create one, evaporated from the picture entirely, as these kinds of buyers always do when the legal ground beneath a shady deal suddenly becomes visible. And then the audit results came back, and they were worse than I had anticipated even in my most clear-eyed assessment of my brother's capacity for dishonesty. Marcus had attempted to access the trust's bank account on 2 separate occasions over the previous 6 weeks, using a forged authorization letter that he had apparently constructed himself, using our father's old, professional letterhead found somewhere in the family home's filing system, a detail so reckless and so stunning in its arrogance that I sat with it for a long moment before I could process it fully. He had not just schemed. He had not just manipulated. He had committed forgery. He had put pen to paper, or fingers to keyboard, and manufactured a false document in a dead man's name to steal from that dead man's estate. And he had done it in the house where that man had raised him, surrounded by that man's photographs and belongings, while accepting that man's widow's comfort and cooking, and unconditional love. I forwarded every piece of documented evidence to the appropriate authorities that same evening, and as I pressed send, I felt something settle inside me, not triumph, not vindictiveness, but the deep and grounded steadiness of someone who has done exactly what they promised to do, who has protected exactly what they were trusted to protect, and who understands that justice, real justice, does not require rage to be effective. It only requires precision, patience, and the willingness to let the truth do what the truth, when properly documented and legally submitted, has always been perfectly capable of doing entirely on its own. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the moment, when you have done everything you can do, when every document has been filed and every legal mechanism has been set in motion and every piece of evidence has been placed into the hands of people whose job it is to act on it, and all that remains is waiting. It is not a comfortable silence. It is not the silence of resolution or peace. It is the silence of a held breath, of a world pausing before it tips irrevocably in one direction or another, and living inside that silence while also carrying the weight of what it means when the person at the center of your legal action is your own brother, and the person who enabled him as your own mother is one of the most quietly devastating experiences I have ever endured. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like mine are sometimes told in a way that flattens the person at the center of them into something purely strong and purely certain, someone who moved from betrayal to justice in a clean, unbroken line without ever sitting on the edge of a hotel bed at 2 a.m, wondering how a family gets to this place, wondering what could have been different, wondering whether the little girl who just wanted her mother to look at her the way she looked at Marcus is somehow still in the room, making decisions that feel too large and too cold for someone who just wanted to belong. I was that little girl. I have always been that little girl, and doing the right thing did not make her disappear. It just meant that I refused to let her make my decisions for me anymore. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised even my attorney. Within 6 weeks of my filing, Marcus had been formally notified that he was under active investigation for attempted trust fraud and document forgery, and the weight of that notification, the arrival of it in legal language on official letterhead, collapsed whatever careful structure of confidence he had been maintaining since the voicemail. The private buyer arrangement dissolved completely and without ceremony the moment the legal cloud became a matter of record, because people who engage in off-market shadow deals with forged authorization letters are not, as a rule, people who are willing to stay in the room once law enforcement begins asking questions. The friend of a friend who had been willing to pay $15,000 in cash under the table to help Marcus steal from his own father's estate simply stopped returning calls, and Marcus was left standing in the wreckage of a scheme that had seemed, to his particular brand of charming and completely unexamined arrogance, like something he could simply talk his way through if it ever came to that. He had spent his entire life talking his way through things. He had never once encountered a situation where the other person in the room had already documented everything, already submitted everything, and had absolutely no interest in being charmed. My mother called me 14 times over the course of 4 days after the investigation became real to her, and I let every single one go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I was not yet in a place where I could hold a conversation with her without either breaking apart or saying something I could not take back. And I owed it to myself. I owed it to the version of me that had driven 4 hours with flowers on the passenger seat and sat alone in a parking lot for 40 minutes to wait until I was steady. I listened to her messages every night. They changed over those 4 days in ways that were painful to hear, even in the privacy of my own space. The first few were confused, slightly defensive, carrying the residue of whatever Marcus had been telling her about legal processes and technicalities and how things would work themselves out. By the middle messages, the defensiveness was cracking, replaced by something more uncertain and frightened. And by the final calls, what I heard in her voice was not the composed, distant woman who had recorded a 37-second dismissal on her son's instruction. It was my mother, stripped of the narrative Marcus had built around her, scared and ashamed and genuinely unsure of what she had allowed to happen inside her own home in the name of trusting the wrong child. On the 15th call I picked up, I did not announce myself with warmth or coldness. I simply said hello and waited, because I had learned from a lifetime of watching and listening that the most important information is almost always contained in what someone says when they are not prepared, when the script runs out and only the unguarded truth remains. She was crying before she could form a complete sentence. She told me she had not known about the forgery. She told me that Marcus had described everything to her, in the language of simplification, of cutting through bureaucratic red tape, of getting the family what it deserved more efficiently. She said the word fraud had never once entered the conversation between them, that she had understood what he was doing as aggressive but not criminal, as perhaps legally complicated but not the kind of thing that would result in investigators and formal notifications, and the complete unraveling of the careful secondary life her golden son had been constructing at the expense of her other child. She told me that Marcus had written the voicemail, that he had sat beside her while she recorded it, had told her what to say and how to say it, had framed it as a necessary step in consolidating family decision-making. She told me she was sorry, not once but repeatedly, in the fragmented, breathless way of someone who understands that the word is nowhere near adequate, but cannot locate anything larger to offer in its place. I believed her, not entirely, not without the clear-eyed acknowledgement that she had still made a choice, that no one had physically held a phone to her hand and pressed record, that some part of her had found it easier to follow her son's direction than to ask the questions a mother who trusted both her children equally would have asked. I believed her grief, and I believed her regret, and I believed that Marcus's manipulation of her had been sophisticated enough to exploit exactly the vulnerabilities that decades of favoring him had created in her: the habit of his judgment, the comfort of his presence, the deep and somewhat tragic human tendency to trust most completely the people we have already decided we cannot afford to doubt. I believed all of that, and I held it alongside the equally true fact that I had driven 4 hours with flowers, and sat in a parking lot alone and listened to my own mother's voice, tell me not to come back, and that both of these things could be real simultaneously, without canceling each other out. I told her what I had told myself in the darkest moments of the previous weeks, that I was still doing what Dad had asked me to do, that protecting his legacy was not a punishment aimed at her or even at Marcus, but a promise made to a quiet man on a Sunday afternoon who had looked at his overlooked daughter and finally, fully chosen her. I told her that honoring that promise was the only thing that had kept me functional through everything that followed, and that I needed her to understand the difference between what Marcus had built, a structure designed to benefit himself at the expense of everyone around him, and what I was doing, which was simply refusing to let that structure stand. Then I got back to work. I contacted the original developer, explained that the legal complications had been resolved, and discovered that they were not only still interested but genuinely relieved. They had been watching the situation and had worried the property would become tied up in prolonged litigation. We returned to the table, renegotiated with the clarity and goodwill of two parties who understood each other's positions, and closed the deal at $405,000. Not the absolute peak of what might have been possible, but clean, documented, legally airtight, and fully reflective of my father's wishes. Every dollar was accounted for. Every distribution followed the trust's specifications exactly. The paper trail was immaculate, and I made sure of that not for legal protection alone, but because my father had deserved immaculate, and I was going to give it to him even now. Marcus avoided criminal prosecution through a formal agreement that included restitution acknowledgement, a documented admission of unauthorized access attempts, and the explicit understanding that any future interference with the estate or its assets would result in full prosecution without the possibility of negotiated resolution. He was removed from any association with the estate's management, permanently and completely. The legal fees and restitution costs, generated by his own actions, were deducted from his portion of the trust distributions, meaning that his scheme had cost him money rather than made him any, which felt like the kind of mathematical justice that my father, who had always believed in accountability, would have appreciated quietly and without gloating. Marcus never spoke to me again after the agreement was signed. I have thought about that silence often. Turned it over the way you turn over something you found on a beach that might be beautiful or might be nothing, and I have concluded that I am at peace with it. Not because I do not grieve the brother he could have been, the family we could have had if ambition had not curdled into something uglier in him, but because some relationships do not survive the revelation of who a person truly is, when they believe the stakes are high enough to justify abandoning every value they were supposed to have been raised with. What Marcus revealed about himself was not something I could unsee, and I had spent enough of my life accommodating things I should not have had to accommodate. My mother and I exist now in a space that is honest in ways our relationship never quite was before, which makes it simultaneously more fragile and more real than anything we managed in the years. When we were performing a version of closeness that served her comfort more than it reflected our truth. She calls. I answer when I am ready. We talk about my father with the openness of people who no longer have to pretend he did not see one of his children more clearly than the other. And there is something quietly healing in that honesty, something that feels less like rebuilding what we had and more like building something neither of us has ever had before. It is slow. Some days it is very slow, but it is real, and after a lifetime of being invisible, real is the thing I want most. I kept my promise. I protected what my father built, not with noise or drama or the kind of revenge that consumes the person enacting it, but with precision and patience and the deep, unshakable conviction that being underestimated, your entire life is not a wound. It is, if you let it be, the most quietly powerful advantage in the room.